macronutrients are absolutely important. Now, the degree to what they're important, and it comes to body fat loss and muscle maintenance, that can be debated. And there is research that shows why they call it a protein-sparing modified fast. And so there's a lot of data out there. And for me, I have to look at the vast majority of data. I have to look at all the data and then combine with my own experience. Then I make my decision of what it says.
Welcome to Corporate Warrior, the podcast that brings you the best advice on how to improve your health, optimize performance, and maximize productivity. With your host, Lawrence Neal.
This podcast is brought to you by HitUni.com. HitUni are a provider of amazing online courses for high-intensity training qualifications. HitUni comes highly recommended by the best in the field, including Body by Science author Dr. Doug McGuff, Discover Strength CEO Luke Carlson, and trainer Drew Bay. It was founded by my friend, author, and longtime personal trainer Simon Shawcross. Simon has 15 years experience training clients and has supervised over 15,000 high-intensity training workouts. Using knowledge from experts like Skylar Tanner, Dr. James Steele, and Dr. Ellington Darden, HitUni is a goldmine for learning everything to do with high-intensity training. The courses are delivered online through the website, where you can learn via a variety of multimedia materials at your own pace. There's online support and a discussion forum where you can share ideas and ask for help. To learn more about high-intensity training and improve my own results, I started their personal trainer course. The content is amazing, and the courses are really easy to follow, and each section is organized into bite-sized chunks that give you a real sense of achievement after you complete each one. I should also mention that there is a DIY course. So this is the course for you if you're not necessarily a personal trainer, but you want to learn more about high-intensity training and how to implement it for maximum benefit in your own exercise regimen. To get your exclusive Corporate Warrior 10% discount on any course you purchase, simply head on over to hituni.com, that's HITUNI.com, and enter the coupon code CW10. That's CW and the number 10. So again, that's hituni.com, pick your course, and enter the coupon code CW10. Thank you for your support.
Dear Quit, hello from Ireland, and welcome to another episode of Corporate Warrior with your host, Lawrence Neal. This podcast is my mission to understand how to better optimize productivity in health, career, business, and lifestyle. My guests include health and fitness giants, underground, rarely interviewed exercise experts, high-intensity training specialists, former athletes, New York Times best-selling authors, business owners, entrepreneurs, life hackers, finance experts, etc., etc. My next guest is exercise genius Ryan Hall, who joins me for a second time on the podcast after much demand from you guys, but also the last episode left me with a lot of questions. And it quickly became apparent to both of us that we didn't allocate enough time in part one to really dig into the various fitness topics that we had planned to. Part two gave me the opportunity to re-listen to part one, prepare some follow-up questions, and probe Ryan on some other conversation topics. I strongly recommend you listen to part one with Ryan Hall first. Ryan is a major partner of Exercise Science LLC, a high-intensity training fitness facility based in New Orleans. He has a Bachelor of Science and Master's in Exercise Physiology and has over 25 years' experience in the health and fitness industry. I came to know Ryan online through the Body by Science Facebook group, and I came to learn that he contributed to chapters 3 and 8 in Body by Science with regard to the genetic factor in response to exercise. In this interview, we cover examples where Ryan has individualized the exercise stimulus for the individual to address things like genotype, fatigue response, fiber type distribution, etc. The potential downsides of shorter time under loads, how to objectively measure progress, and specifically improvements in strength, the importance of the negative portion of the exercise, the value in using high-intensity interval training alongside high-intensity training and how to apply it effectively, how to train for performance, and this can be considered an expansion on the Ideal Program for Athletes Chapter 10 in Body by Science, fat loss and dieting, Ryan's personal training program, and we talk about much more than that. I was so pleased to see the reaction to part one, and I really hope this episode is going to answer a lot of your questions, and I'm confident that you will enjoy this just as much, if not more, than the first part. If there are any outstanding questions that weren't answered in part 1 or part 2, please do leave a comment on either Corporate Warrior on Facebook, so that's facebook.com/Corporate Warrior, or on the blog post, which can be found on 15minutecorporatewarrior.com/podcast. And now, please enjoy this part 2 with none other than Ryan Hall. Ryan, thank you. Welcome to Corporate Warrior. Thank you for coming back on the show again. I appreciate you taking the time. As we were talking about before, I guess we started recording, I've got when we first spoke, we only got through one kind of section of questions because there were a bunch of questions submitted by listeners and people on the Body by Science Facebook group, and obviously I had a bunch of my own questions, so I'm keen to dig into some of those other categories of questions, and they're quite diverse. So just to I guess start off with, almost to reference back to part 1, which I encourage people go and listen to our first interview, which I will link to in the show notes of this one. You've done a lot of work on individualizing the exercise stimulus to the individual client, which we talked about at length before. I just wondered, because you talked about why that is and how that works, but I just wondered if you'd be able to give a few examples of clients you've had, maybe at your existing gym or previous gyms that you worked for. Sort of, can you give us some different examples of where you've individualized the exercise stimulus and show us how that can vary between individuals? So, by basically, I suppose you could just describe the protocol you gave to, I guess, two individuals who have very distinct, different. Have to have different exercise protocols to stimulate results for them, if that makes sense.
Sure. Actually, what's interesting, Lawrence, right before you called me, and this is just one of these just happened yesterday. I was actually thinking about this same question that you're asking me now.
Oh, perfect.
And so one of the so let me start out by saying this. I actually did a small calculation to see what is perhaps the average number of people I've trained over the length of time I've been doing this. Okay, so I started when I was 18 years old. I'm 45 now. At one point in time, at my previous training studio, I was training between 100 and 120 appointments a week. And, now I don't want to work quite so much anymore, so I'm not. But I did an average, so about maybe how many clients I've trained. And I'd probably say an average of 80 training sessions a week. I gave myself a margin of error to do 75, and I multiplied that out. And it looks like I've trained about 100,000 training sessions.
Oh, wow.
So that's quite a big number. And whenever you work with that large population, you're always going to run into the ones that are plus or minus 3 standard deviations from the mean, the real outliers. Okay. And I've had the very, very good fortune of many of my clients literally have stayed with me for over 20 years. 15 years. That's not uncommon at all. I actually have 2 clients that I started training when I was 18 years old who still train with me now.
That's incredible.
So here's one I was just thinking about that I was working with yesterday. And her name's Leslie. She's 58 years old. And she started with me probably 17 or 18 years ago. Now, some of this is a great example of selection bias, okay, or survivorship bias. So Leslie came to me years ago because she was in chronic pain, mostly back and hip, okay? And Leslie never made really positive results from exercising before she started training with me. And if you think of the standard exercise recommendations, that they're usually fairly high volume, okay? Whether it's resistance training, or at least was in the past, or endurance training, what is it, 30, 45 minutes every day, 5 days a week, whatever. So anyway, she first started coming to me for low back and hip pain, and we made some results on that. But she's always struggled with basically trying to manage pain. Okay. And it's interesting because after opening Exercise Science and really tweaking the stimulus for her, it's really this year that first time that she's completely pain-free after all this time. I think part of that's due to, the MedX core spine technology, the care equipment that we have, like the lumbar extension, the rotary torso, that kind of stuff. But what I've done, Leslie, we just started, and this really gave me sort of an insight into her metabolic responses and muscle fiber type distribution. Her and her husband are actually going to be leaving next week to go on a bike trip somewhere in Europe. I don't remember where. But she wanted to, increase cardiovascular capacity for that before they left for the trip. So whenever I do the high intensity interval training, I usually do it on the bike. Let me say I almost always do it on the bike. I really don't like doing anything on the treadmill, and I won't do that. I've seen too many accidents in gyms where people have, fallen off and shot into the wall behind them, running on a treadmill. And I try to keep mine as safe and controlled as possible. I can measure things on the bike, like I can measure the heart rate response, I can measure heart rate recovery, I can measure the electromechanical level, I can measure the work output in watts. These are things I can document and measure and improve on each and every workout. Leslie has more of a glycolytic fiber type distribution, so people with that metabolic response or that fiber type distribution, you're going to see just from a few exercises of all-out intensity, it literally just wipes them out. They get a huge metabolic response from even, doing the resistance training. Heart rate goes way up high and the whole thing. Someone with an opposite response, like an oxidative response, you're not going to be able to get their heart rate that high at all. Matter of fact, sometimes they can reach failure and still talk like they were jogging. And so, a long time ago, I didn't know what that was due from. At first, I always thought these people aren't training very intensely, but no, they'll literally go to failure, push, their muscles just stop, but they're not metabolic, don't have any metabolic stress at that point. So Leslie being the opposite of that, and us starting to do the high intensity interval training to help her with the bike work, literally, it's funny, I can get her heart rate up to 193 beats per minute after 3 30-second intervals. I can bump her up, boom, 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 and she is literally just out of it. So that's a total of a minute and a half of exercise, and she's completely wiped out. We don't count the recovery stage, on the intervals in between.
Sorry, how much time between the sprints is she having?
For her, because she works at such a high pace, at such a high level, like minimum of a minute, but sometimes she'll get a minute and a half. Okay. And but literally, it's like, boom, it's unbelievable how high I can get her. And it's really because we mostly were doing rehab work before. Whenever I do rehabilitation work on the spine, stuff like that with the equipment, I always use a relatively lighter weight for that individual and try to keep them on a little bit longer to give me a margin of safety, not to jack the weight up too much, but sort of to micro load those tissues over time that they're having injuries with. And so I didn't really get that peek into Leslie's metabolism until I started doing the interval training with her. where it's interesting, someone that's more either to the middle of the oxidative glycolytic spectrum, or someone especially who's on the oxidative end of the spectrum, you're going to need to fatigue them more slowly over time. So you're going to have to start with a lower level. You're going to have to do more intervals with maybe a little less time in between. And so, like with Leslie, for example, let's say I get her on the bike. I can go mechanical resistance, right? We can do level 12, level 13, level 14. Boom, she's done. If I took an oxidative person, and it's interesting because that's the only woman that I train, even out of the younger ones, that I've ever had able to hit level 14 on this particular cycle ergometer. Otherwise, I'll have younger women that maybe can hit 13, but Leslie, she's 58. She's so glycolytic, she can hit that high level. She has the strength-based tissue to do so, and it really takes a toll on her metabolism when that happens. I have another lady that, again, I've been training for over 20 years, Tiffany. Tiffany is, again, close to 60, if not 60. She looks... If I show you the picture of some of these people, you'd never believe their age. I mean, it's really unbelievable when I see you take care of yourself, how much you can turn back the clock. But Tiffany's on that opposite end of the spectrum. She's much more oxidative. And so if I try to, let's say we're doing the high-intensity interval sessions on the bike, if I try to turn up the tension for her too quickly, what happens is literally she just can't pedal. Her legs give out, but she's not even breathing heavy. So for someone with that, like that, I have to start at a much lower level. Instead of going 12, 13, 14, I might have to start at 10 or 11 and do 2 interval sessions at 10 with 30 seconds in between, and maybe like a minute rest, and then do 2 interval sessions again at 11, and then 2 interval sessions at 12, 2 interval sessions at maybe at 13, and then she's done. But that's the only time I can get her up, is if I start much lower and fatigue her over time. And that really fits with basically the fiber type distribution and the characteristics of the individual fiber types.
That is really interesting. So how would you, if you've got someone who's, say, new to, let's say they're doing high intensity strength training, but they want to incorporate high intensity interval training on the side, how might you advise that they try to figure out what protocol works for them? Is the self-discovery quite easy in terms of, like, well, let's see how they respond to, I guess, if they're on an ergometer or the machine you described, like if they're using a high level and they're exhausted very quickly, then they're likely to be more glycolytic, or how might you advise someone?
Yeah, so it's easier for me to see because let's say I've been training these people for a number of years, and whatever their metabolic response is going to be on the resistance training, it's going to be the same response with the high intensity interval training. So if I've been training these people resistance training, right, on the Medix equipment for a number of years, I know sort of where they fall on that oxidative glycolytic spectrum. And so it's easy for me, or easier, to determine what sort of they need to do on the bike. But that's exactly what you just said. That is a way to do it. So there's many different ways to do high intensity interval training. I just pick I like to stick to standards, okay, so I can sort of have documented measurable improvements, right? And so there's some people who might start out, I might do a minute at a time, and just that allows me sort of a discovery period, right? I might do 1 minute intervals separated by a minute rest, and then depending upon the response they give me, then I'll be able to more easily tweak the program to where I can fit their metabolic responses. So sure, that's one way to do it. If you get someone on and they can ramp up quickly and really exhaust themselves in a very small amount of time, they're going to be on the glycolytic end of the spectrum. And you'll have, again, someone else who might be able to tolerate a larger volume or duration of training. If you'll see it where they just can't pedal and they're not even breathing heavy, but their muscles give out. They're probably more on the oxidative end of the spectrum. Now, if we think about a standard bell curve, okay, most people are going to fall in that middle. So if you just take sort of a standardized interval training session, most people are going to respond very well. They're not going to fall outside of that curve either way. As long as, Lawrence, as long as they're making improvements, as long as you see that more, I like to measure work in watts. That's the output on this particular bike that I use. And so the level, obviously it's electric. This bike is like an electromechanical device. And so I'll measure level, but what I'm really looking at is work and it measured in watts. And that's going to be determined by the electromechanical level times their RPM. Now, the revolutions per minute, right? So I'll have some specific revolutions per minute that I'll want them to do during training and during recovery. But again, that's going to vary. It's not going to be as perfect as when you're training someone and you have on a machine, you're doing a specific cadence if you do cadence, okay? Their revolutions per minute are going to vary as they become fatigued, but generally what I look for is them to keep the revolutions per minute above 80 during the work or the challenge stage, right? And above 60 during the recovery stage. And if you go, part of that is because if you go much below 60, the bike actually turns off. So I have to keep it at a certain revolution per minute. But if you measure watts, you get a much more accurate indicator because some people just like to pedal faster. And so you may have someone doing, 100 revolutions per minute. And so as long as they're keeping it above 80, that's sort of where I set the standard. And then now if I'm working with some subjects that are extremely older, for example, like maybe in their 80s, 84 is one of the guys I did yesterday. He came in, we did the resistance training, and actually we did the bike first for him, which I normally do the resistance training first. But my revolutions per minute are going to be a little different. I found some older subjects just have difficulty pedaling at a fast speed. So, you have to adapt that per the person.
So just on the subject of incorporating high-intensity interval training alongside high-intensity training, I think it was in Body by Science that, I could be wrong actually, that I read if you move quickly from exercise to exercise, and I guess kind of what's kind of inherent in exercise that is as intense as high intensity training, you don't actually require a supplementary high intensity interval training program alongside it. Is that true? And if not, how worthwhile can this combination be of actually having a training program where you incorporate both protocols?
So that's a really good question, Lawrence. And the thing is that, again, I've found that to be highly variable. If you fall sort of in the middle of the oxidative glycolytic spectrum, or you're more glycolytic, you're going to get a very good cardiovascular response or metabolic response from doing just the resistance training, and especially if you move quickly from one to the other. But people who are more oxidative in nature, they're not going to get the same metabolic response from doing the resistance training. Even if you go quickly from one to another, they're simply going to have more fatigue resistance. And what I've found with those people is that they will require another stimulus in order to get a metabolic response. Again, I can think of a number of subjects that I work with individually. This one lady, Peggy, again, she's, in her 60s. And even though I may have her for a long time under load, she's literally not strong enough to elicit those type of metabolic or cardiovascular responses by doing the resistance training. Even though she's been trained for a number of years, she can reach failure, and it's almost like she's able to talk, like she's jogging. And I've done this with a number of subjects. We're talking about people that are sort of the outliers here. Okay.
Yeah.
So, the chance that someone's going to be one of those outliers are normally kind of small, right? Because plus or minus one standard deviation from the mean basically accommodates for 66% of the population. Plus or minus two standard deviations from the mean is 95% of the population. But when you work with a large number of people, you are going to run into those that are the outliers, and we have to train them accordingly to their genetics and their metabolism in order to get them results. So what may be a general recommendation for a general population doesn't fit for those people who lie to the outsides. And so someone who's very oxidative, they simply don't get that response by doing the training. And I can look at this by measuring heart rate response that's far from a perfect science. The whole 220 minus your age, that's all BS. There was something that came out in the Journal of Exercise Phys about that some years ago. And we're looking at something that's highly variable. But for example, this lady, Peggy, I'll have her on the machines, and she'll go to failure. I keep her on for a longer time under load because that's what fits her fiber type distribution metabolic profile better, and she's made better results doing that. But she still doesn't get, if I measure her heart rate while we're doing with a heart rate monitor, she will rarely ever break 100 beats per minute. She just doesn't. But if I put her on the bike and I conduct that properly, I can get her up to 130, 140 beats per minute. For her, that's probably close to her max. And so it all depends on who you're working with. If you're working with a subject who's very glycolytic, you can see the metabolic responses. You can measure them with a monitor if you want to. You don't always have to. But usually what will happen is there's things that you can observe. They're going to be breathing extremely heavy. There's no way they're going to be able to talk or say any few words whatsoever. They're going to fatigue very, very rapidly. And it's going to take a real toll on their metabolism. Literally like 3 or 4 exercises if they're training intensely enough, and they're completely spent. Just boom, out of it. Okay. There's not going to be this 10 to 12 exercises for them. It's just not going to happen. It was interesting because I was listening to your podcast with Luke Carlson and James Fisher, and they were both talking about how many exercises that they've done and how many times a week they train. But while I'm listening to this, I'm also listening to the fact that Luke trains for, is it marathons?
That's right, yeah.
And James trains for triathlons.
Right.
So if you're going to be anywhere competitive or even be able to tolerate that volume of exercise, you have to have a specific fiber type distribution and specific genetic profile in order to even do that. So that's another example of selection bias. Okay, and that if you're having people that are able to tolerate that volume of activity and improve at that, then they're going to be able to tolerate higher volume and duration of exercise. Where, let's say I have someone, it's really interesting because now I know some of the same genes that correlate with someone's ability to adapt and tolerate an exercise stimulus actually are the same genes that are strong correlators to musculotendinous injuries. And these people just need more recovery. They make more microtrauma. They need more recovery. They can't tolerate a high volume of exercise. So it's almost not a coincidence that many people come to me with different injuries and back pains.
No,
and so,
sorry, go on.
Yeah.
No, sorry to interrupt.
Well, no, it's okay. I mean, that's just where, we have selection or survivorship bias. I see it all the time, almost everywhere. And so, that just listening to that, because I'm listening to their exercise recommendations. And if I take someone like Leslie, for example, literally we do 3 or 4 machines and there is nothing left. Okay. And that's also for myself. I'm very glycolytic. I can handle a very heavy load for a short period of time, but then I'm just wiped out. I've measured my heart rate and I've gotten up to 198 beats per minute. We're doing either squats, deadlift, leg press, or leg extensions. 196 on the Medix compound row. And so basically, I'm at my max just from doing the resistance training, where you're going to, with that type, and that's only on being on the machine for a minute to a minute and a half, that I'm reaching, what you would think would be basically above my max, if, for my metabolism, and I'm dead. Boom, there's no more. And so, but someone, for example, that's going to do well with marathon training, right, or Ironman training, they're going to be able to handle a larger volume of exercise. Matter of fact, a smaller volume of exercise is not going to have an effect on them nearly as much. I would
only challenge you to say I don't think that Luke, and I could be wrong, James have done these types of activities their whole life. I think Luke's only been running marathons so long, and James, I don't think he's been doing triathlons so long, so I'm not sure if they inherently cope with a much larger volume. I mean, I can't remember. You probably remember their workouts better than me, but I think they work out twice a week in a high intensity training regimen. But I wouldn't say it doesn't seem to be a high volume to me. But do you disagree with that? Or?
Well, I'm using relative here. Okay, so relative to, let's say, Leslie, relative to me, we're using a much lower volume than they're doing. I mean, if I do 3 exercises for a minute and a half with Leslie and she's done, if you were to do 12 exercises with her, that's quadrupling her workload.
Yeah.
Do you see what I'm saying by that?
Yeah, I hear you.
So I'm using a relativity here, even though I wouldn't call their necessarily just their training or on the machines high volume necessarily, relatively to what someone that's very, very glycolytic can tolerate. It's a higher volume. And so, and someone like Leslie, I think one of the reasons why she probably came to me is with typical exercise recommendations being what they used to be, as far as, every day, that's something that she simply couldn't tolerate. When we, dialed down the, when we dialed down the amount of volume, not only with resistance training, but when she stopped doing a lot of her outside activities and started focusing on the high intensity interval training, literally it's the first time in her life she's been pain free.
That is very interesting, and it's really, as you're describing how she responds to exercise and yourself, I can relate to that so well, because I'm the same in that I started doing Project Kratos, Drew Bay's program, and I just couldn't cope with the volume. So after a single set of failure on push-ups, chin-ups, one-legged squats, and I don't know, maybe one other exercise, I was absolutely whacked, and I actually had to abbreviate the workouts into 2 shorter workouts, very much sooner than he would normally recommend it doing this program. That being said, I'm not a beginner, so I think if someone were doing Project Creators for the first time, they could perhaps cope with the volume at the start, whereas I was coming into it with a few, several years of sort of strength training behind me. But I'm very similar to you in that sense, in that I couldn't cope with, I don't think, with the volume that perhaps Luke does when he does, his 10 to 12 exercises.
So yeah, that's a perfect example. You're getting a really good eye into what your metabolic responses are. And so if you go all the way and you're really wiped out after doing just a few exercises, literally, if you tried to push it too far, you're either gonna pass out, you're gonna be on the floor for a hell of a long time, you're gonna be seriously experiencing some maybe exercise-induced hypoglycemia, or you may even push yourself to vomit. We've had that happen.
Yeah. So. Does this also? So this is this the same for recovery as well? So if you're highly glycolytic, and you can only cope with a small volume of exercise, does that also generally correlate with that means you need to work out less frequently as well?
Yes, generally that's what we found. Now, I don't want to. What's the word I'm looking for? I don't want to paint too broad of a brush because there are genes that actually control for that. Mm-hmm. We discussed one of them last time, myosin light chain kinase genotype, where if you had this specific genotype, you created a lot more microscopic damage. But there are genes that really show influence, like, for example, if you're going to be better as a sprinter or a high-level sprinter or a high-level endurance athlete, that really correlate to fiber type distribution, like ACE, angiotensin converting enzyme genotype, really influences where your fiber type distribution is going to fall on that oxidative glycolytic spectrum. So what we've generally found, and this is also sort of, I sent you some of the articles and some of the earlier research that Arthur Jones did with the pre-Medex isokinetic servo-powered Nautilus devices, where he found one subject that reached below 75% of their strength in as little as 3 repetitions, where you had another subject reached below 75% of their max strength with 34 repetitions. So it's interesting. Yeah, it's interesting. I'm pretty sure I sent you the links to those articles.
I've got them. I'm going to put them in the part 1 show notes for sure.
Yeah, and so that it's actually that strongly correlates to not only what we're seeing with the differences in genotype and fiber type, and Jones was just making an observation, and I think that's one of the things that Jones did really well, is in those days they didn't publish a lot of peer-reviewed studies, and peer-reviewed studies usually look at a mean, X bar, the average, okay? But what we see is there's no such thing as an average human. We have tremendous variability, and that we discussed a lot of that last time. And I think with Jones not publishing at that time, not until after Medex had gotten underway, he actually looked at individual responses much more deeply than I think, traditional research was done. Now we're starting to see more research being done on inter-individual variability, and we know just what genes accommodate for that. Some of the genes that accommodate for that.
Just on I guess before we move on to some other questions in other categories, just talking about time under load for a second. When we spoke first time around, you were talking about how you generally aim for with your clients. I think 1.5 minutes to up to 2.5 minutes, generally speaking, as a time under load on the exercises when you're doing strength training. And I seem to remember, I think this was in Body by Science again. This could be wrong. That Doug was. I think claimed that actually, you could the minimum time of the load could be as little as 45 seconds or 60 seconds. And I know that Kieser, they were the I think they Swiss or German exercise organization. They advocate 60 to 90 seconds time under load. And I just wondered whether there was a detriment to these shorter time under load at all, and whether there was a reason for you kind of aiming for that upper segment, it would seem.
Well, okay, so, and that's another great discussion topic. Okay, so what I've done, we do things a little differently at my place now. Okay, so traditionally early on we did super slow, right? Which kept the cadence 10 seconds up, 10 seconds down. I haven't used the cadence in a long time for several reasons. And what I try to do is to get someone to go as slow as they can and lift as heavy as possible. That's why we sometimes will do like 80% of a 1 rep max, I think we were talking about before. And depending upon someone's fiber type distribution is to determine how many reps they get or how what their time under load is going to look like. So what I want someone to do is to lift as slowly and smoothly as they can. We don't want to sacrifice smoothness for slowness, and as heavy as possible within their fiber type distribution time under load range. So for example, my own training, and a lot of this has to do with sort of innate neurological ability. So there's some people that can go very slow, lift a heavy weight, and keep it under control. There's some people who can't. I'm going to give 2 examples again as maybe outliers, okay? Someone has a very efficient or effective kind of innate motor ability, and this is all in the study of motor learning, correct? So they're going to be able to have a high degree of dexterity. They're going to acquire skills a little more readily, and they're going to be able to lift a heavy weight more slowly without segmentation or breakdown. Now, let's say you take someone the opposite end of that spectrum, like someone with Parkinson's. Okay, when someone's with Parkinson's, if they have the shakes, if they just sit still, they're trembling. Okay, but if they move quickly, if they walk fast, it actually smooths out. They can actually walk just fine without the shakes. And so, again, I'm giving you 2 individuals on real far opposite ends of the spectrum, okay, with regard to neurological and motor ability. But so there's some people who, and again, this is an outlier, right, that can't really stay that smooth on the equipment. When they break down, when they start to go at a slower type speed, things start to segment. Okay, and we sort of call that pulse modulation. And if you think about, I always use, a lot of times I'll use automotive terms in order to describe physiological terms because they really fit well. Let's say you have an engine that's tuned sort of mildly, right? And they have a cam in the engine that allows you, and most standard cars are designed for efficiency, right? So the engine can idle at a low RPM smoothly, all right? But let's say you want to hop up the car. So you take an American muscle car, let's say, and you stick a big old, radical cam in the block, and the engine doesn't idle very well at a low RPM. So you hear flub, 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 right? In order to make sure that engine doesn't break down, you have to turn up the idle RPM. So it has to idle at a higher RPM. There's some people that can move very slowly and smoothly, and some people that can't. Now, regard to the specific, so that's sort of speed of movement. And speed of movement is going to be more about degrees per second than a cadence. So let's say I have someone doing a pullover. A pullover is approximately like a Nautilus pullover, let's say. That's a 210 degree range of motion. Okay. Now let's say we have someone doing a hip abduction machine, right? That may be, they may only have 45 degrees, if that much, at a max. Let's say even 30 degrees sometimes, range of motion. So if I try to make the person doing a pullover at a 10-10 cadence versus the hip abduction at 10-10 cadence, the degrees per second are going to be way off. So I don't usually look at cadence anymore because it really depends on the actual movement itself. And so it can vary depending on exercises. And so, and that particular individual's, like I said, innate motor ability. So some people we allow to go a little faster because they just don't have the motor ability to go very, very slow. But with my more advanced subjects, I like them to go as slow as possible and still lift a heavy load without momentum. And so a lot of that's going to have to do with the speed of movement. You look at muscle force velocity curves. It kind of gets very, very technical at the time. When I tell you, like, I'll stay on the machine for anywhere between a minute to a minute and a half, that's only doing 3 repetitions. But that's how slow and also how heavy I'll lift. And I'm using 80 to 90% of my max, depending upon the exercise. It takes a lot of skill and a lot of practice in order to get there. And again, a specific fiber type distribution to do that. So a lot of the recommendations on the time under loads is really going to be dependent upon the speed at which you're having the subject train for. So it depends on, if Doug, for example, might be recommending a super slow type protocol, although I don't think he uses specific cadence anymore.
I know these days.
Then you're gonna wind up with a little bit longer time under load. Where if you're using more traditional speeds of movement, let's say 2-4, or something like that, your time under load is going to be lower. It's interesting because Drew Bay and I talked about this a while back. He took the same load and he trained at super slow speeds of movement, and before he reached failure, he recorded the time under load. And then he did it at a faster speed of movement and noticed the lower time under load. And at the time, he was hypothesizing that moving at a faster speed of movement creates a deeper inroad. And I've been actually critical of that term inroad because it's not necessarily completely physiologically descriptive of what's actually happening during the process. And I can actually send you a write-up that I've done on that before, being critical of the term inroad.
Yeah, please do.
But there's another way to look at it.
Quite a vague term. Go on, sorry.
Yeah, it is. But there's another way to look at that, and I proposed this to Drew. I said, so you can either look at it in that you inroaded in less time using a faster speed, but did that cause the same amount of fatigue and microtrauma as the other way? I mean, you can look at the fact that if you lasted longer with the same weight, right, going at a slower speed, that means you could use a heavier weight at a slow speed for a lower time under load, which would be more advantageous. So by going slower, he could actually handle a heavier load, and that would be more advantageous. So you're able to fatigue more deeply and cause more microtrauma during the eccentric component of the movement by using a slower velocity. And we've had some conversations, and he's done some write-ups on the force velocity curve after we've talked about that. When you look at muscle force velocity curve, it shows you that even increasing the speed of sarcomere shortening velocities a little bit decreases your ability to exert force dramatically. And these are, this is old muscle physiology research. So when you see people able to lift heavy loads, moving in a faster movement, it really means they're using a lot of momentum, Lawrence. And if you look at the way most people train, they kind of pop it up in the beginning, even if they slow it down towards the end. But that pop in the beginning, that sets the momentum off from the get-go.
Yeah, completely.
That start of that movement, that lower turnaround, is where you either make it or break it. And so I'm sure we got off on a few tangents there. We're talking about time under load.
No, it's great. You answered the kind of core question. But it's interesting you say this, because my view on cadence has sort of evolved since I first got into high intensity training. I originally always would try to stick to sort of a 10-10 cadence with maybe a 2-second pause at max contraction, and then I varied that and tried 5-5, and then I kind of learned, and as Doug talks about now, I kind of let the cadence express itself more organically. So I still measure time under load, but I normally naturally use a cadence that I feel comfortable with, which is maybe 3-4, 2-4, something like that. But then I make sure that the turnarounds at the start and end of the range of motion are really controlled, like you just described. But then I noticed that obviously when you come to that final rep or final few reps where you're very fatigued, you're going to generally have a much longer cadence, because you're struggling to complete the range of motion. That can sometimes be as many as sort of 20 plus seconds in some cases.
Yes. Exactly. And so I think we've all sort of moved that way almost organically over time, just to, and so if you're training with really heavy, like a really heavy percentages or one repetition maximum, you're really focusing on reducing momentum, it's almost like you can't go faster. And that is sort of dictated by the muscle force velocity curve.
And so long as the muscle is under tension, right? I think my understanding is that, and what we're seeing is that really cadence doesn't matter when it comes to providing an effective stimulus, so long as you're not cheating with momentum and stuff like that.
Exactly. So, the deal is that, acceleration is a vector quantity, not a scalar quantity, meaning it doesn't just have magnitude as direction. Okay. So we change acceleration the most when we work out, right? When we lift, when we change direction. So if you really, one of the things that we've been doing for a very, very long time is I've always focused on turnarounds. When somebody comes to the lower turnaround, I don't even want to hear that weight stack touch. That's how in control I want them to be. The weight stack is going to touch, but I don't want to hear it. And when they start the next repetition, there's no firing out aloud whatsoever. There's no momentum. At least that's the way we train people. So we really, really look for those really perfect, smooth turnarounds. And if you do that, you're pretty much reducing momentum as much as possible. And whether you accelerate slightly, throughout the mid part of the range of motion, that's totally cool.
It reminded me of a very amusing conversation I had with Simon Shawcross, who I had on the podcast a couple of times, a good friend of mine and also a business partner. Say business partner, I obviously Hit Uni's his business that promotes the show. So we went for coffee once, and we were talking about, why isn't high intensity training more sexy, and why isn't it kind of more, trending more and more popular, certainly in the UK, where it's really, the high intensity training that we talk about is still so unknown and underground, whereas the term high intensity training has been, means so many other things to people in the sort of health and fitness space, which isn't what it really is. And anyway,
Yes.
So we were talking about this, and I was saying, Simon, why isn't it catching on? It's so efficient, it's so effective, it's a game changer for me. Why is that? And he was saying that, well, you and I will look at someone training and we'll see them do a really smooth turnaround when they're handling a really, really heavy load, and we're going, well, man, that was a sweet turnaround. And like me and him, he was saying you and I will find that sexy and appealing, whereas most people are like, what? You're not throwing a big weight overhead in a snatch or whatever it is. It's not like CrossFit sexy. And that was, you going through that just reminded me of that conversation we had. So it's fond memory.
Yeah, most people in a gym, most guys, whatever the case, they're trying to demonstrate strength. They're not necessarily trying to build strength. You walk into a gym and they're heaving big weights around. Well, the other reason why it's not sexy, is because it's damn hard. And, most people just want to get in and count out the repetitions and, pump through a set of this or that. They're not looking so you see this, and I don't mean to be insulting to anyone, but you wind up seeing this in children. Whenever we've tried to train younger children, they're very goal-oriented, not necessarily process-oriented. So what you see is, for them, it's just get the weight up, okay? And they'll squiggle and squirm and do whatever they can to do so, rather than, okay, we need to go to failure to cause microscopic damage, milk every last eccentric as much as possible to stimulate that growth mechanism. I think it takes a certain amount of maturity in order to do so, and proper exercise for me is all about intellect over instinct. I mean, the instinct is to fire out or just pump out as many weights as reps as you can and be done with it. Okay. And it takes more intellect in order to say, wait a second, let's think about what is this stimulus, and how do we apply this stimulus in the safest manner possible. So I've always said proper exercise is about intellect over instinct.
No, I like the saying. It's a good reminder. Just another thing we spoke about how you can objectively measure strength when we last spoke, and I wanted to ask you a question about that. So Keiser use a device that they fix on the Med-X machine. I think it measures your force output. I could be wrong, and I just thought that was an excellent way of measuring changes in strength. So if they put that device on and they normally do it on like a chest press and a leg extension, maybe something else, and they'll do it at the start of your training, and then you'll do it maybe a few months later to see how that's changed, as I guess one perhaps objective measure to see if your strength is improved, rather than, I suppose, trying to look at your just relying on your training records. Now, are you familiar with that device? You know what I'm talking about?
Are they so? Okay, I think you're talking about a force gauge, if I'm not mistaken. But I don't know what that company has done in particular. Do they do it statically, or is it a dynamic test?
Correct, it's static, and I think they fix it on I believe they fix it on the stack somewhere, and then you just press against it as hard as possible, or contract as hard as possible.
That's actually a really good way to estimate strength. It's not going to be as good as the original Med-X machines that I'm talking about, the medical line, because they took, and again, you can find this on that authorjonesexercise.com. Jones had written a book explaining a lot of the development of the Med-X equipment, this was done, I think this book was written in the early 1990s. This is when I was still an undergrad, and I was going to some of the seminars that they were putting on at the University of Florida. I went to the University of UNO, but in Gainesville, they were putting on free seminars. And I got one of these books, and now you can get it in PDF format. I recommend everybody read it who's interested in strength testing or whether, fiber type distribution, all kinds of other things. But he outlined all of the 5 factors of non-muscular torque that the original Med-X testing devices included. And, one of them, for example, was they had to measure body torque. Okay, so let's say you're doing like a lower back exercise, right? Let's say we have someone that's very large but very weak. When they start out in the movement, they're lifting not just the weight on the stack on the machine, but also their body weight or the mass of their upper torso, right? And as they fully start to extend, their body torque is falling back on that, so it's assisting them. So Med-X used a variable counterbalance in order to take that factor out of the equation. Okay, so I mean, now I'm getting really into the nitty gritty stuff of what the original Med-X testing was designed. So that was almost, let's say, a perfect way to measure strength, because you got rid of all the factors of non-muscular torque, stored energy, impact forces, all this other stuff. Okay, but besides not having those types of testing machines, if you just put a force gauge and do it statically, that is, I think, an excellent way to measure strength.
Cool. Is that a thunderstorm where you are? I can hear.
Yeah,
that is some thunderstorm, isn't it? That is powerful.
I was a little worried for a second if we might lose electricity. We don't do that all the time, but sometimes it happens. So yeah.
God, it sounds pretty scary. Well, hopefully that doesn't happen. But if it does, we've definitely recorded some great conversation. But anyway, so moving on, I wanted to ask you a couple of questions on negative training, which you did mention briefly in the first part. So one of the questions that was submitted was your thoughts on negative accentuation and its application, and you also mentioned in part 1, how important. I wondered how important the eccentric or negative part of the movement is for reasons including hypertrophy, in your opinion.
Oh man, the eccentric component of the movement is paramount. That is where the actual microtrauma is occurring. Okay, so this is what happens during normal concentric eccentric movements. Okay, as the muscle fatigues, okay, ATP utilization in the larger glycolytic fibers is outstripping the rate of ATP production. Well, let me back up just a little bit. We look at something very subcellular. We look at an individual sarcomere, which is the smallest contractile unit of a muscle. We look at what the sarcomere is made of. We have cytoskeletal proteins, we have tethering proteins, but our main contractile protein, right, is actin and myosin. And we have the cross-bridge mechanism that occurs where the myosin head reaches out, grabs the actin filament, and it attaches and releases, and it shortens, and you have more heads that grab on and pull. And whether you nod your head or I move my hands, all these movements are happening millions of times a day in our body. Okay, that is where ATP is the eventual fuel for every cell in the body. All metabolic pathways eventually break everything down into ATP. But for muscular contractions, in order for the actin filament to release from the attachment point at the myosin head to release from the actin filament at the attachment point, you need ATP. If ATP is not readily available, then that head can't release and it enters a state of rigor or stiffness. Okay, so during fatiguing contractions in some of the larger glycolytic units, ATP utilization is outstripping the rate of ATP production. And what you have during each subsequent stretch of the eccentric component, first of all, at the cross-bridge mechanism, it works as brakes, but if they can't let go because ATP is not being readily available, each subsequent stretch of that stiffened fiber creates that microtrauma. You see actually complete disruptions of the Z disc or popping of the Z disc, tears along the plasmalemma, tears, and I can actually send you some biopsies you could put if you wanted to on your website. Or I could put them on my website. You could link back, and you can actually see this under a microscope, what it looks like before and after an eccentric stimulus. So the eccentric component is almost paramount in my mind. And from the vast majority of the research literature, now you're always going to have. That's why whenever we look at scientific studies, we have to look at what is the global view of the research literature pointing towards. And when you look at stuff like even like intracellular signaling, molecular mechanisms, almost everything is pointing to the eccentric component of the movement as being necessary to induce hypertrophy. So I don't think one has to do straight eccentric necessarily. And Dr. Ellington Darden asked me this a long time ago, what were my thoughts on that. So what my experience has been is training especially if someone's already advanced, training heavy eccentrics, because it's a heavier load than you can normally do, can lead to overtraining very, very rapidly. Now, not in beginning subjects because they're not strong enough to elicit that response. But for advanced subjects, if you're gonna be, a very, very, very heavy load and do straight eccentrics, you can overtrain very, very rapidly or cause some damage, some macro traumas possibly, not just micro trauma. But as far as just straight concentric eccentric training, the eccentric is definitely needed and paramount to stimulate or induce the mechanisms that need to occur for a hypertrophic response in skeletal muscle.
So would that mean that if you're performing an isometric, like static contraction type movement, that would be suboptimal because you're not getting that eccentric portion of the movement?
You hit the nail on the head, my friend. That's exactly right.
All right.
And that's from the vast majority of research shows. And so you also see the vast majority of the research showing that static or isometric training, you only develop strength around the angle trained and not through the full range of motion, at least from the vast majority of research literature I've looked at for a very, very long period of time. And it's not the best way to train for muscular hypertrophy. So the only time I ever do, I guess I prefer static holds. I mean, if you have like some equipment where you can measure the force output, right? Like when you're talking about the Kaiser machines, where they measure strength, mm-hmm. Okay? At least you're having, you can document improvement. But otherwise, I prefer a static hold where you would lift the weight and hold it at a certain level. And I only really do that for early stage rehabilitation. If someone has too much pain actually trying to move through the joint, we'll often do a static hold in order to stimulate some strength and tissue remodeling. But the real stimulus for tissue remodeling is going to come from the microtrauma, and that comes from the eccentric component of the movement primarily. So eccentrics are extremely important, and that's why I'm not a big fan of static or isometric training.
It's interesting because I'm thinking not that someone's neck has, much potential for muscular hypertrophy just based on, I suppose, the geometry of it all. But would that mean that, something like a 4-way neck machine would be far better than a time static contraction exercise for the neck? Would that principle be the same, or do you think there'd be very little? Because I do time static contraction currently, and I just wonder whether that would be suboptimal for that.
I think it would be suboptimal. I think moving through the full range of motion or the potential full range of motion is, but Lawrence, I mean, you use whatever tool you have available, I've actually gotten to the point where, and it's interesting because Ken Hutchins taught me this a long time ago, where you can use manual resistance if you have a partner, for example, and they know how to apply it. Manual resistance to where you could fatigue that muscle through a full range of motion. So what we would do is we would sort of do 4 repetitions. And now this is when you're doing manual resistance, right? The subject, it's going to be subjective, but the trainee is going to be applying the resistance, and I'm going to be controlling the time. So let's say we do 4 repetitions. You're going to give me 25% of your effort. Then on the first rep, you're going to resist 25%. We're going to do 50%. The second rep, 75% or all the way. And then only on that 4th repetition, we're going to go all the way out. By that time, you're already going to be fatigued, and I'm not going to have to resist very much, but you're actually able to do full range training when you don't have a machine or something that's able to properly load that musculature. So I did that with a good friend of mine who's also a trainer and comes to train with me in New Orleans, Celeste. We did we did the neck, and she actually Celeste Landry Fortier. She commented on one of the questions I think she had.
Yeah, she did. She asked about your car, I think.
Yeah, that's right. My all Trans Am. Anyway, I did that with her, and after we did it, she said that was better than sex. So, wow. But I'll also do that so I don't have a rotator cuff exercise machine, and there was only one time produced by Nautilus for a short period of time. I didn't really like it. But in order to do rehabilitation with the rotator cuff, I will do manual resistance exercise. So that's one way to get around having to do a time static contraction with your neck, is that you could actually probably do it yourself. You could do manual resistance.
How would you perform that exactly?
Well, you'd have to be. I would probably sit in a chair where you're. You could do it. We usually do it on the row machine. Okay, so I would sit in a chair with my chest against it, and you would cup your hands, both hands, right, and grab your occipital lobe, and then stretch your neck forward as far as you can comfortably. And then it takes some practice, but you would start exerting a force of, again, it's going to be subjective, about 25% of your maximal force while you're resisting and controlling the speed of movement with your arms. Okay? So you control the tension with your neck, and you're giving tension and controlling the speed of movement. I would recommend super slow or very, very slow reps with this. And you would be able to keep tension on the whole time and do those 4 repetitions that way while exerting force with your arms and your hands against your head. And it can actually be a very, very effective way to train.
Yeah, I'm familiar with a similar protocol. I've always found it difficult to do it, especially if you're doing it after you've already done some intense
upper body
work. Yeah, so it's perhaps in that instance, it's best to do it at the start of the workout, where your arms aren't so fatigued, perhaps.
Yeah, probably, and it does take a lot of practice. I mean, it takes a lot of it. It's difficult for me even when I'm doing it with a client. It takes some practice for them to learn what's going on, because they're not necessarily don't understand how to keep tension on the whole time or when to give me tension. So there is a learning curve to that, a large learning curve.
Cool. So just I guess just talking about stuff like that, where you haven't got instances like that, we haven't got a neck machine. It sort of is a neat segue into kind of bodyweight training. I just had one question on that for you. Obviously, since the closure of Keyser Training in London, I've been doing bodyweight high intensity training at home. I started using Chris Highcock's Hill Fit program, and then moved on to Drew Bay's Project Kratos. And I just wondered, what are your views on the potential downsides of bodyweight training? I have had some discussions with a friend about perhaps the lack of improvement in things like bone mineral density when you're not under heavy loads, but I don't know how solid the research is on that.
So probably the best study on that, and I can send you links to this too, and actually I can send you bone biopsies looking under a microscope also. Cool. The best study on it, the name of the study was bone mineral density increases in postmenopausal women are site-specific and load-dependent. Okay, so if you look at runners, for example, their lower leg bones and sometimes their hips are going to have greater density, but not the spine. If you look at a tennis player, their dominant racket arm is going to have twice the density of their non-dominant arm. The beautiful thing about resistance training is we can target any joint in the body, okay, with appropriate equipment. All right. And the thing is, you use whatever tool you have to the best of the ability. I mean, I just happen to have some of the best tools, I think. The super slow, the Med-X, when Med-X actually produced super slow equipment, when they had a joint venture, you could say. But if you don't have that, then you use whatever tools you can. So obviously something like and there's obviously ways to increase intensity without necessarily increasing resistance. But, so a protocol of chins, dips, push-ups, some of the stuff Drew Bay does with Project Kratos, even if you had to use TRX straps and stuff like that, there's things that you could do to target some areas. The hardest part you're going to have in stimulating growth is probably going to be the legs, because you're not going to be able to squat or deadlift without some type of load. And so, I was going to have a friend come in yesterday at the gym, but he couldn't make it, and he was going to have me show him some stuff that he could do at home, basically. And I'd recommend, obviously getting some push-up stands. And if you do really, really, really slow push-ups and you're really focusing on, let's say, stretching in that lower turnaround position with those push-up stands and barely easing into it, man, if you really, really train someone with those, they're not going to be able to do a whole lot of push-ups at all, considering a slow enough speed of movement and perfect turnarounds. And so you use whatever you have. We do crunches sometimes with people. I have a special way where we actually do it really, really slow. There's no tension hold off. I only keep them within the angular range of motion where their abdominals are going to be loaded. And you really don't have to do a bunch of those at all, in order to get much out of it. So, you use whatever tool is available to the best of your abilities. I have good tools, so those are the ones I used in the past. As we talked about last time, I had a set of barbells and dumbbells at home, and I used those, So as far as body weight's concerned, the only thing that's going to be a real negative for you is I would think probably the lower body work.
Yeah, I sort of moved on to the single-legged squats that Drew teaches, using door handle for balance. And
yes.
They are absolutely brutal. And yeah, I can't do very many at the moment before I reach failure. And one of the workouts, my A or B routine is chin-ups followed by push-ups, followed by I think it's the single-legged squats after that, and I'm just absolutely gassed after that, so yeah, that's tough. But I do miss the some of the Med-X machines dearly, because they're just so effective at what they do. I used to use, obviously, the I can't remember the exact name, but the Med-X rowing machine, the pull down machine, and the leg press. I used to use those fairly frequently at Kisa training in London.
Right.
But I'm moving to Ireland soon, as you know, to live in Galway, of all places, and I'm not very hopeful that there'll be sort of Med-X or Nautilus or that type of equipment there, unfortunately. But we shall see. Who knows? Maybe I'll ship some stuff in if my own business takes off. We'll see.
Hey. Yeah, man. That's the way to look at it. Look for opportunities.
Right.
You might have a nice opportunity on your hand with that.
Yeah, absolutely, and it's definitely something I've been thinking about. So watch this space. Okay, so moving on to a question here from a listener regarding training for performance. I can't remember the name of the man or woman who left this submitted this question, but what they've said here is, what are the changes to strength, to yours, and addressing you, Ryan, to your strengthening and conditioning protocols, if any, would you make to bias toward performance goals like absolute strength, power, and speed? For example, keeping time under load toward the shorter end of the spectrum, or any other potential guidelines or trends not discussed in Body by Science in the chapter about ideal programs for athletes?
So that's a great question, Lawrence, and very interesting, because I actually wrote a paper on that when I was in college or grad school. I think it was grad school. And it's actually available on my website. I reduced it. It's called Specificity of Speed, where I got into, basically training for sport performance. Okay. And the deal is that we have muscular strength. And one of the things that was discovered, many isokinetic devices at the time were trying to measure variations in strength, power, all these other things. And what they found out is they're basically all correlated to strength. Okay. Measures like power, those are external measures of work, not necessarily internal measures of work. So there's nothing magical that goes on inside of a muscle, like training fast twitch motor units and training slow, train slow. Motor units are recruited on the basis of force threshold or force requirement. It's not necessarily speed of movement. And so, if you're going, and skills are very, very specific. Okay. So in motor learning, there's 3 types of motor learning. Number one is there's positive transfer, where the skills of practice and performance are identical, and improvement in one is going to lead to improvement in another. There's another type of transfer, which is indifferent transfer, where the skills of practice and performance have almost nothing in common, and improvements in one will not affect the other at all. For example, football and basketball, just 2 completely different sports. Okay, but there's another type of transfer in motor learning, which is called negative transfer, where the skills of practice and performance are closely related but not identical, and can actually lead to neuromuscular confusion. So you'll see this. Let's say your event is to shoot a 16-pound shot put, and you say, well, I'm going to try to get better at it. I'm going to use an 18-pound shot put. That's actually the wrong way to go. And the closer that weight is, without being your exact weight of the shot put that you're going to use in performance, the more neuromuscular confusion is going to occur. So just like in any type of sport, you're going to want to use the exact same ball or same brand of ball as close as possible. possible with the same inflation, the same everything, so you can duplicate almost perfectly the skills of practice and performance. Okay, there's just no need for any other way. So if you train to get stronger, that's going to have a positive outcome on your ability to exert force during your sport. But you have to train your skill specifically for the sport. So, when we talk about training, I mean, I don't, as far as strength is concerned, I don't think there's a different, when we train humans, I don't think there's a different way to necessarily train athletes as far as switching the training protocol to accommodate for a specific sport. Again, I would train you according to your metabolic responses. And if your metabolic responses and muscle fiber type distribution happen to fit the sport that you're competing in, then you're going to do well. That's where the genetic component comes into play. For example, if you don't have the fiber type distribution to be a competitive sprinter, you're simply not going to be a competitive sprinter. And if you don't have the fiber type distribution to be a world-class marathon runner, you're not going to be a world-class marathon runner. You're just never going to take Carl Lewis and turn him into a marathon runner. The same thing we look at, let's say, the genetics for a jockey compared to a football lineman or a basketball player. So genetics are going to dictate how well you do at a particular sport. The training is going to amplify that. But if your genetics don't suit you for a particular sport, then you're not going to be very competitive at it unless you're just doing it for recreational purposes. So there's a difference between recreational athletes, right, and then competitive athletes also. So, I would train people to the best of their ability within their genetic profile and fiber type distribution, and then whatever they're going to do is going to take off from that. Now, having said that, there is a high degree, muscle has a high degree of plasticity, and it can adapt to, the way it's used, the neurological input. I had to take one course in college. I don't know why. This was an activity elective, but I was already working at a health club. I already had my own training program, yada, yada, yada. But they called it was like some, I don't know, physical fitness, or it was pretty much running. We just ran 3 days a week. And one of the things that I noticed from doing that volume of running, that we did, because we ran for maybe 45 minutes 3 days a week, I couldn't train my legs during that period of time. And they were overtrained for me just doing that volume of running. I didn't adapt to that very well at all. I did lose some strength, but I actually did gain some endurance. When I went back to doing leg extensions, my time under load changed a bit. And so it was interesting after that experiment. So, yeah, we do have an inherent degree of flexibility, but that's not necessarily optimal for you where you sit on that spectrum if you train according to your fiber type distribution. So you can make changes. It might not be optimal for you, for that person. So it would really depend on what the sport was. I mean, I've trained people not only from strength-based sports, let's say, or someone like one of my trainers, Scott. We trained this guy Andrew for a few years. He's in high school, but he was going to go into the military, and in order to get the officer position or whatever he was going to do, he had to pass a physical fitness test of so many pull-ups, so many push-ups. And it was interesting when we started training the guy. Again, he's in his optimal, elevated testosterone age, 16, 17. But over a year period of time, he put on 30 pounds of muscle. That was very significant for him. And he could do the push-ups and the sit-ups, but having the extra muscle actually hurt him for the chin-ups. because he just had more muscle lift now all over his whole body. So he, in order for him to pass, also he had to run, the mile in a certain amount of time or whatnot. So he did practice the running. We got him under his time. But in order for him to lose some weight to make him better at the chin-ups, he not only cut his diet back a bit, he started running. Now, did it affect his strength? Absolutely, it affected his strength. But he was able to more optimally perform at the activity he needed to. Now, on the other hand, I've also trained some people that were doing. At one point in time, I trained this girl, Vicky. She was number one in their state for duathlons, over 40. This is some time ago when I trained her, and she had won that. And you wouldn't think, if you looked at her, she was actually a small, short woman that was pretty muscular. And she would gain a lot of strength during the off season. During her on season, I would have to be very, very careful. We train once a week, and I would train upper body one workout, full body the next workout, and then upper body the following workout. She was only having leg exercise every other week, and all we could do was try to maintain some type of strength. But it actually gave her a competitive advantage in the biking because she was much, much stronger. So yeah, there's things you can do to improve. Just by getting stronger, it will improve your performance. It really depends on the person I'm working with, whether they need to pass an event like Andrew, or they just want to be very competitive. I've trained another girl, Gretchen, for throughout her. She did she actually did an Ironman, and it was just something that she just wanted to make a challenge for herself. And, unfortunately, that involves a lot of volume of training, and she wound up getting some injuries from that afterwards. So now that she's not training for that, we're actually working her through some rehabilitating some injuries, basically. So okay. If that answers somewhat, I don't know if I answered the question perfectly.
No, you did. It was a very, very complete answer. I think they'll be very satisfied with that. I certainly was. So I've got a few more questions, one on fat loss and something on epigenetics. And then I wanted to talk a little bit about your training if we've got time.
Sure.
So another question from a listener. What dietary and environmental changes should be made in order to make epigenetic changes in DNA expression to promote weight loss or leanness? Which I think leanness is probably the better description.
So, and it's interesting, again, we have some inherent genetic variability here also, okay? First, I'll talk about some cross-cultural research, okay? And it just goes to show you sometimes how varied things can be, okay? Mm-hmm. Cross-cultural research can actually answer a lot of questions, and this is stuff I looked at way back when I was an undergraduate in college. I was writing several papers. One paper I wrote was Antioxidant Nutrients in the Prevention of Cardiovascular Disease. But you look at some cross-cultural research. If you look at the East Indian, their diet is almost entirely, carbohydrate-based, plant-based with very little meat. And there's also a very low incidence of cardiovascular disease, or at least there was at the time I looked at this, and cancer. And then again, if you look at the American Eskimo, their diet is almost entirely fat and protein, but they also have very little incidence of cancer and heart disease. If you take a sample from each population, you switch their diets, they got sick. So what becomes difficult is, or at least where we originate, our ancestors originated on the globe, may have something to do with an ideal diet for the individual, which sort of makes America a little bit difficult because we have a sort of melting pot, right? I mean, I'm probably half French. As far as I can tell, I'm 25% English and 12.5% each Irish and Italian. But there may be some other mixtures in there too. I'm not sure. So there was a list of questions a long time ago on this one study I looked at. This was a long time ago. And depending upon how you answered, it actually had like maybe 14 different subclassifications of diet, but there were 3 main ones. There was your typical high carb, low fat diet. There was more of a sort of zone-based diet, which is 30-30-40, and then they had more of a ketogenic diet, the high fat, at least what I've found combing through the majority of the research literature, ketogenic dieting works well for a lot of people. Now, we are going to have people who don't respond well to a ketogenic diet. Both my parents are diabetic, so I already know what my genotype is for that. So if I'm trying to get leaner, and in fact the only way I can get lean for me is to stick to a ketogenic diet. And so there's some other interesting research on that, and I can give you links or send you this. You could, if you wanted to put it for your listeners. There was one study that was done, and this was sort of very eye-opening for me. They had 2 groups of subjects. One group of subjects did a low calorie, it was 1,500 calories per day diet with it was higher carbohydrate, low fat. Okay. Then you had another group of subjects that did a ketogenic diet. So very, very little carbohydrate, and they had to be in ketosis. And they ate actually 1,800 calories per day. So they ate 300 more calories per day than the higher carbohydrate group did. And the ketogenic diet, actually, that group lost more body fat and more body fat around the midsection than the group that did the lower carbohydrate diet. The higher carbohydrate diet, low fat diet, even though they consumed 300 more calories per day. Now, this was a crossover design, so they gave them a washout period and they switched the groups. And then the same thing occurred. The group that did the previous 1,500 calories per day higher carb, low fat group did the ketogenic diet and actually lost more body fat and more body fat around the midsection. So
what was the
and the other group?
Do you remember what the protein amount was for within each diet? Because I know that a lot of people listening to this will argue that was different, or that may have had an impact.
So I have even more research than that. Okay, but I don't remember exactly what the same protein content was. But I can send you the link to that study.
Yeah, please.
But the deal is, when you go into ketosis, not all of your, so there's a dangerous kind, ketoacidosis, but then there's ketosis lipolysis, which is a conversion of fat to ketone bodies to use as a fuel source. Okay, and when you're in ketosis lipolysis, not all of our cells can use ketone bodies. Many of our cells need glucose to run off of, for example, brain cells, okay? And so any glucose units needed for that is going to rob your dietary protein of those stores to turn the protein into glucose by removing the nitrogen component. That's a metabolic pathway called gluconeogenesis, and it's actually net ATP consuming. I have another paper on this. It takes more ATP to run that cycle than you actually get out of it. And that's why that group was able to consume more calories but have more fat loss, is because of gluconeogenesis. Now, the reason why you had more fat loss around the midsection, we all hear that midsection fat is the most dangerous fat. I don't think it's necessarily the most dangerous fat, but it's a reflection of the body's hormonal profile. So when people did the ketogenic diet, they had decreases in fasting insulin, increases in insulin's antagonist, which is glucagon, a fat mobilization hormone. You had changes in leptin and ghrelin and all these other things. And it was that hormonal profile which reflects less body fat around the midsection. So at least for the majority of the people that I have worked with, and some people need a real strict diet. There's not everyone can I say, look, go out and cut your carbohydrates. Okay. There's a plan. I don't know if they do it in the UK, but here we have something called Ideal Protein. And it's usually run by a nurse or, by an appropriate medical type staff, or out of a spa or somewhere where these people can be tested. And so it's very, very strict. It's like a 1,500 calorie a day diet. It's lean protein sources, and they make sure you're in ketosis. So I've had several clients that have done that program that couldn't lose weight on their own, and they were able to drop 30 pounds over a fairly short period of time. And that's just, I'm not saying that that's the only way to do it. I think from what the research literature shows, it's probably the fastest and one of the more effective ways to do it. But you're going to have, when we're talking about individuals, like I was talking about the East Indian and versus the American Eskimo, I mean, you're going to have people that are going to have different genotypes where that might not necessarily be the best plan for them. So there is inherent inter-individual variability. And within the study that I just talked about, you actually had there were inter-individual variability. You'll see a graph where they track each individual, and some very few people, but some people did actually really, really well on the lower calorie, higher carbohydrate diet. So it becomes a bit of you have to play with that for each individual. So for me and for many people I've worked with, by at least reducing carbohydrates, and now the training helps with that also. I mean, having more muscle tissue, having more oxidative enzymatic adaptation. We know that resistance training decreases fasting insulin levels by an average of about 35%, even with a short-term program. So we can reduce fat storage hormones with training. There's another study that looked at a higher carb, low fat diet, higher carb, low fat combined with resistance training, a ketogenic diet on its own, and a ketogenic diet combined with resistance training. And the name of the study was something like higher protein, lower carbohydrate diets have an additive effect, because the group that lost the most body fat and maintained the most muscle tissue was the ketogenic group that did the resistance training. A long time ago, again, this was back when I was in college, I assisted with, it was called the Committed to Kids program, and it was run out of LSU Medical Center in conjunction with Children's Hospital, and it was a childhood obesity program. And they had to come in. It was interesting because we used a multi-specialization approach. The exercise physiologist ran the program. You had a dietitian, you had a child psychologist, and a pediatrician. And although the physiologist ran the program, you had all these other disciplines that also, participated in this study or in the program. And there was one of two diets you could do. You could do just a lower calorie diet, higher carbohydrate diet, low fat. But the recommended program was called protein sparing modified fast. And that's another word for ketogenic diet. And the group of children that did the ketogenic diet, at least on an average, always performed better as far as weight loss and body fat loss than the other group. And so another word for ketogenic is protein sparing modified fast. And there's other research that we can look at where you'll see on an isocaloric diet, so same calories, one group had the higher carbohydrate, low fat, moderate protein, and the amount of, if I'm getting my numbers correctly, amount of body fat loss was 72%, and amount of lean tissue loss was 28%, where the ketogenic group, you only had 5% weight loss from lean tissue and 95% weight loss from fat tissue. So there are many studies out there.
That's really interesting because for a while, I was big advocate of high fat, low carb, and in fact, when I've done it myself, I've seen really good results, and I've had it measured using BodPod. Actually gained muscle and lost fat in across a 6-week period. I was doing high intensity strength training, but I was only doing 6 minutes a week at the time.
Right.
But I had, just before I interviewed Gary Torbs, I had, and just to step back a second, I was always I'd thought, okay, so you eat, for most people, you eat a large amount of carbohydrate, it elevates insulin, and therefore it signals the body to store fat, and that's why a high carbohydrate diet is responsible for that. And actually, calories it's not just about energy expenditure. It's calories are information more than just units of energy, and they obviously control all the different sort of hormone signaling and stuff within your body. And I was really kind of believed that almost quite dogmatically, which obviously is never good, and should always retain an open mind. And I had a lot of people leave questions on the blog post for the Gary Torbs episode, who were quite, they opposed him quite aggressively in some cases, and a bunch of literature was posted on the post exploring actually how it's all about calories in, calories out, and I'm kind of now in a position where I don't really know, if I'm honest. I love talking about it, and obviously it's really interesting hearing your thoughts, but I just wonder, like, do you what do you say to the group of people that they feel very strongly that it's all about calories in, calories out, and actually these macronutrients don't really matter whether you're high carb or low carb? But I assume you probably disagree with that based on what you've learned and your experience.
Yeah, and most of my what my opinions are based upon what the research literature shows, or at least the vast amount of research literature shows. Okay, and so if it was all about calories in, calories out, I mean, there's two conditions found in undeveloped countries, which one is kwashiorkor and one is marasmus. I don't remember which one was which, but one is just a lack of calories. Okay, and that's I guess, you see the children that are really, really, I'm sorry, let me back up. One is a lack of calories and a lack of protein. Okay, and you see that's I guess our in my head, it's kind of the old Ethiopian, GoFundMe type videos, where you had the child that was really thin, no muscle, with a distended stomach, right? I don't remember what that was. That may have been kwashiorkor, where the other one, marasmus, and I don't know if I have these two terms mixed up, but one was only a lack of protein with sufficient calories. And what you saw was someone that they didn't have this distended stomach, but they literally had no muscle mass and a lot of body fat. So one of those conditions wouldn't be present if it was just all about calories. Okay, so macronutrients certainly are important. I mean, if you were meeting your sufficient, so let's say we took here's an intellectual exercise, okay? Let's say we have two groups of dieters. And one group, you gave them reduced calories, but 100% of their calories came from pure nutrient-ridden glucose, okay? And even the other group just had a low-calorie diet, but was a mixed diet with sufficient protein, carbohydrates, fats, okay? What do you think? Are both groups going to have the same results at the end of the study? No. So macronutrients are absolutely important. Now, the degree to what they're important, and it comes to body fat loss and muscle maintenance, that can be debated. And there is research that shows, why they call it a protein-sparing modified fast. And so there's a lot of data out there. And for me, I have to look at the vast majority of data. I have to look at all the data and then combine with my own experience. Then I make my decision of what it says. But again, one of the things I actually wrote a little article on this about when you put together a training protocol or a diet protocol or whatever the case may be, each piece of data, each study represents a brick. And the more bricks we have, the more solid our foundation is, the more solid our house is. Where we can have breakdowns is where we use logical glue or mortar to hold these bricks or studies together. And that's where we can have fallacies is in our logic or our reasoning. Or we may try to speculate outside of a particular study parameters, and that's often a mistake. Okay, so the more bricks you have, the more you know about the global research literature. It gives you a better picture of what's going on. And so I have probably 3,000 studies on my hard drive, and I try to read it. It's interesting because people ask me, do you read this blog? Do you read that blog or whatever the case? And I don't. My nose stays firmly planted in the research literature. I feel that's the best way for me to get an untainted view of what's going on, and I can make my own decision rather than when I get somebody else's opinion. And is that after I look at?
Sorry, Ryan. Is that PubMed you normally go to for that?
Yeah, PubMed is the one you go to where you do your original search, National Library of Medicine, and then now everything's on the internet now. I mean, not all of the studies are freely available. I'm not with an institution anymore, so it's not. I either have to get it through a friend, but you can often find online now. It's beautiful because you can find all the previous studies that were cited by that study. They'll give you links to, right? Instead of having to download the PDF or what we used to do in college, which was go to LSU Medical Center Library and print all the journals out and make photocopies and go look everything up. But you can do a search now, and they'll even show you now what newer studies reference that study. So you can just click, and get this ultimate amount of unlimited data for free almost that you can read, and you can read everything. So that's the best way in my mind, is if each individual can teach themselves to read the research literature directly and read as much of it as possible, that's literally the best way to learn and the least expensive. Don't have to buy anybody's book.
Yeah, very good point. Do you? I was reading a comment on Drew's blog by James Steele, Dr. James Steele, who's been a guest on the podcast and a good friend. He mentioned something quite good, which is he always goes straight to the methods when he's reading a study, and if the method isn't, bulletproof, then he'll I'm not sure if this is completely accurate, but I think then he won't perhaps waste his time consuming the entire study. Do you have tricks like that? Like, do you go straight to the methods when you read a study if you think it's really low quality, or just next, pass, move on type of thing? Or how do you assess the quality?
You do have to take everything into consideration. Reading an abstract can give you an idea, and just because a study is not perfect doesn't mean we can't learn anything from it. I mean, sometimes we can learn to do things the incorrect way. You know what I mean? So I do absolutely look at the methods, and that's why when you read research on resistance training, it is extremely difficult to draw conclusions from that, because they all use different volumes, different frequencies, different exercises, different set numbers, different equipment. The number of variables become almost mind-boggling. Okay, and so you really have to look at everything. However, at least reading an abstract can give you an idea what the study can tell you, or read the conclusions, because in the conclusions they'll often make guesses. Sometimes they'll speculate, and I don't always agree with the speculation based upon what the data says. So it is really important, if you can get the full text of the study, to go through everything and look at the methods. The research methods are going to be very, very important. And it depends upon the individual data that you're looking at. I mean, if you're looking at a more simple study, or I should say more basic research, where let's say you take a rat or a group of rats and you train them, and then you cut the little buggers open, right, in order to see what happens inside the muscle, that's a much cut and dry form of research than looking at various training protocols and the output in humans, or whatever various measures you're looking at. So there's a difference between sort of like basic research, basic physiology research, and then things like training studies. Okay, where they're using different volumes, different this, different that, different parameters. And sometimes, ideally, what we would want in science is to change one variable at a time and study what effects that change in that variable had. And that's not what you often see in, exercise studies, whether it's resistance, endurance, whatever. There'll be you see multifactorials. And so you don't know what change and what variable caused the response.
Yeah, good point.
So that's all very, very important to look at.
I just want to be respectful of your time, Ryan. Are you okay to go over a little bit? Because I've got 2 more questions I wanted to ask you.
Sure, yeah. Lawrence, I'm good.
Cool, good stuff. So tell us sort of briefly, what does your training program look like currently? And how have you personally changed the stimulus over time to suit your genetics, as we've been talking about?
Okay, so what's interesting about this is I'm actually still continuing to get stronger after as many years as I've been doing this. Okay, and we don't have a genetics test right now that measures all the genes I want to look at. Like 23andMe, they may be able to tell me 1 or 2 genes that has an influence on what they call athletic performance, or I would just call simply the ability to tolerate and adapt to an exercise stimulus. And there was one company, I think it was Sweden. It was a long time ago I looked this up. They were doing a very intense genetic test on multitude of factors that influence athletic performance, but it was like 900 euros at the time, and that's when the dollar was doing worse than the euro, and my clients aren't going to be interested in buying that, so I'm not going to have enough data. I might do it for myself one day if I'm interested to see what I am. My training actually has a good bit to do with how much stress I'm under and how much I'm working. Okay, so what's my ideal training protocol when I'm more rested versus when I'm highly tired from being on my feet all day long? And so right now, I am extremely busy with work and overdone for the most part. I came home last night and I went to bed as soon as I got home. I was just exhausted. So I will normally I am much more on the glycolytic end of the spectrum. I can handle a very heavy weight for a short period of time or a lower number of repetitions. I train with a high level of my 1 repetition maximum, which I just tested just to be curious, and we did it a long time ago, and we do it sometimes now. I don't recommend doing that unless someone is actually trained already and they warm up properly, and they do it without momentum. But I'll usually do it depending on what the workout is. I'll do either between 3 or 4 exercises, and I'm on the exercise for I only go for 3 repetitions, and I'm usually on the machine for either a minute to a minute and a half with those 3 reps, but that's how slow that I go, still lifting a maximum amount of weight. It depends on what exercises I do, whether I'm going for a total overall full body, if I'm doing something like deadlifts, overhead press, and then the next thing I may have only left to do is like biceps. I don't have enough juice because deadlifts is heavy deadlifting wipes out everything. Okay. And so, and then sometimes I'll do pieces parts where I actually need to do pieces parts. So I'll have a workout that might be, let's say lumbar extension, lateral raise, the cervical extension, shrugs, something where I do pieces parts, and I may alternate between that. Ideally, I actually do better with a split routine if I have enough. And so I may do, let's say 5 exercises for an upper body workout, just to give an example. Let's say I do the seated dip, I do the MedX row with the super slow cam, I do either chest press or an overhead press, and then let's say bicep curls, and that's my workout for that. And then when I'll combine, let's say legs and spine, and so let's say I do like leg curl, leg extension, leg press, rotary torso, and maybe neck. And that might be my workout for that day. It just that's when I'm on my recovery. I'm not working as much, and I can do a split routine and alternate between that kind of stuff. I mean, the cool thing is I have enough tools to vary my workout routine to what's going on at the time. So, but lately it's just been full body workouts, either 3 or 4 exercises. And I notice if I go for 3 reps and really, really slow, it's much easier on me, Lawrence, mentally, that I can go all the way and just use that low number of repetitions, but higher time under load by going really, really slow and just knock it out. But after, like I said, depending on what the exercises are, 3 to 4 exercises, I'm spent, I'm done. Boom, that's it.
No, that's really interesting. Cool. So Ryan, thank you for that, and thank you for your time today. I really appreciate it. What's the best way for people to contact you and find out more?
Everything would be available through their website. If they go to exercisesciencellc.com, they can have links to, I have several articles up there, I have blog posts, I have, you'll get links to the Facebook page, the company's Facebook page. They can feel free to friend me personally on Facebook. We have Twitter, we have all that stuff. So yeah.
Awesome. And please do email me if you remember all the stuff we talked about today, exercise and diet related, in terms of the studies and articles that you mentioned, and I'll get those. I'll definitely link out from the post onto those, or to those I should say.
Will do, pal.
Cool. And for those listening, for all of the show notes for this episode and all episodes, please go to 15minutecorporatewarrior.com. That's 15minutecorporatewarrior.com /podcast, and all of the episodes that I've done to date and will be there, including part 1 and part 2 with Ryan. So Ryan, I will let you get on, and it sounds like the thunderstorm's finished now, but that was I was getting quite aggressive in the background.
It's still happening, but it's not quite as bad.
Nice. Cool. So enjoy the rest of your day, and as soon as this is ready to go and live, I'll be in touch, and we can promote.
Great, Lawrence. Thanks. You got it, man.
Cheers, Ryan. All the best. Take
All
care.
right, pal. Take care. All right. Bye-bye.
Before you head off, for a free ebook with 6 interview transcriptions with world-class performers on how to optimize productivity and health and fitness, and weekly updates from me on the latest podcasts and blog updates, head on over to 15minutecorporatewarrior.com/ebook. That's 15minutecorporatewarrior.com/ebook, and enter your email address for instant access.